Last time I checked, there were 40 million people on statins, by the way. So I would like people to hear that. And when you think about skeletal muscle health, there is a large amount of literature out there that when you have healthy skeletal muscle, when you preserve lean body tissue and you target skeletal muscle at rest burns free fatty acids, burns fatty acids, it burns triglycerides. When you have healthy skeletal muscle, when you exercise skeletal muscle, you will see nearly an immediate impact on both triglycerides and HDL. Again, it's a cumulative effect, but it is somewhat immediate. Over time, exercising skeletal muscle, by the way, also does not require insulin. When you think about metabolic syndrome, you think about elevated levels of triglycerides, high blood pressure, you see increase in glucose, increase in insulin, all of which can be corrected with skeletal muscle, with the primary focus on skeletal muscle. As well as when you do a plan that you attempt to address body composition by purely restricting calories, you do nothing for your mitochondrial health. And I know you talk about mitochondria a lot. Skeletal muscle houses a ton of mitochondria. When you leverage exercise with caloric reduction and prioritizing dietary protein, not only do you have a sparing effect, but you make your mitochondria more efficient. And that becomes really critical to understand, that a lot of these metabolic issues not only can be corrected with healthy skeletal muscle through resistance training and appropriately feeding it, but also at a root cause level, when you have sedentary, healthy skeletal muscle, again, just based on the weight of it, the pathology, when it becomes pathologic, and again, the way that you think about that is skeletal muscle should be trained and it should look like a fillet. Over time, if you are sedentary and you are overeating, there's nowhere to put carbohydrates. You are not creating flux. Again, it is this movement of substrates. You have to deplete glycogen. You do that through exercise. When you do not do this, you see skeletal muscle insulin resistance begin to happen, which again makes insulin less effective. You require more, you see higher levels of blood glucose, and over time that can be very damaging. Yes, skeletal muscle is a first line treatment, and I believe a vital sign that we're not measuring.
Curious if you could, you may not know the answer to this, but you mentioned statins. I did a bit of a deep dive in the literature on statins and the distinction between absolute risk reduction versus relative risk reduction. And this is as you know, like a sort of status quo modus operandi sort of way that pharmaceutical companies generally will overstate and overrepresent the magnitude of the effect of a particular pharmaceutical by talking about relative risk reduction versus absolute risk reduction. So, for example, just for listeners, I know you know this, obviously, Dr. Lyon, but if someone told you that the risk of something bad happening to you was 1 in 10,000, or let's say 2 in 10,000, but if you took a drug, it's 1 in 10,000, the absolute risk reduction is meaningless there. You still have the most minuscule risk possible, but they could say, well, it was 1 versus 2, therefore it was a 95 or 100% reduction in risk relative to not having this drug. And that kind of distortion happens all the time. So they will take, statins, basically the absolute risk reduction is something around 1%. Sometimes I've seen it as 1.3% or 0.8%, but then you see all these claims talking about 35%, 43%. And the trick of what they're doing there is relative risk reduction instead of presenting absolute risk reduction. And it's been shown in studies that people in the general public overestimate the magnitude of the effect size of statins in reducing their risk of cardiovascular disease by over 100 times. In other words, to use their methodology, they overestimate the efficacy by over 10,000%. So, and that's obviously intentional. It's because they're great marketers. They know how to market this to the general public to make them perceive that it's so effective. I'm curious, given that, if you can quantify the difference, the magnitude of effect of statins in reducing your risk of heart attacks versus exercise.
You are bringing up a very important point that individuals do not recognize or talk about. I couldn't tell you that exact number. I haven't looked at the data of a statin versus exercise, but one thing is for sure, you will have market improvements in nearly, there's nothing more powerful than exercise because of the implications that it has on whole body homeostasis. There is not one medication that does everything exercise does.
Mhm.
So I think that that's critical to understand. The other thing about a statin, I just want to mention this because for the listener, if they're thinking, ah, my doctor put me on a statin, we were the last country to change the cholesterol recommendation guidelines, by the way. We changed the cholesterol. We finally took the cholesterol out of the guidelines. There was a period of time where it was recommended to only have 300 milligrams of cholesterol or less a day. We were the last country to finally take it out, and we took it out in 2015. And part of that reason is because we also have the highest statin use.